Story 1. The Unexpected Tenant. I once resided in an elderly residence nestled deep within the countryside, almost entirely enveloped by a dense collection of trees and expansive fields. Although it wasn't an active agricultural establishment, our property was home to goats, a pair of chickens, several canine companions adopted through rescue efforts, and whatever other creatures my mother had generously taken in at that specific time. My mother, a dedicated veterinarian, essentially operated a small-scale animal shelter directly from our home. Consequently, the air within our dwelling perpetually carried the distinct aromas of hay, animal fur, and the various medicinal concoctions she routinely prepared in the kitchen for ailing animals. The setting offered a profound sense of peace, yet there was never a dull moment. There was always a continuous cycle of animals being delivered to our care, clever raccoons managing to infiltrate the feed bins, or curious tourists inadvertently straying onto the hiking trail that meandered directly behind our property. This particular trail gained considerable popularity during the spring and summer months, primarily attracting hikers and dedicated bird watchers, and occasionally individuals would pause to offer a friendly wave if we happened to be outdoors. I was a naturally quiet child, and I typically spent the majority of my afternoons after school sequestered in the old stable situated behind the main house. That venerable structure served as my private sanctuary. Inside, I maintained a substantial collection of books, a comfortable sleeping bag, and a couple of chairs I had relocated there for enhanced comfort. It truly was the place where I could retreat to read undisturbed and unwind with the animals, free from any intrusion. As I recall, one particular Thursday, I remember the day distinctly because I had endured a terrible test that day, a total failure. I arrived home from school following my usual routine. I unlatched the side gate, my backpack already half open, and was quietly munching on a granola bar as I made my way towards the stable. Ordinarily, our dogs would be eagerly awaiting my arrival by the gate or would be sprinting enthusiastically up the path to greet me. However, on that day, there was no sign of them whatsoever. I called out their names, but initially there was no response. Then I detected barking, though it was muffled and subdued. The sound was unmistakably emanating from inside the stable, which struck me as peculiar since the dogs were never confined there. I theorized that perhaps my mother had, for some unknown reason, placed them inside. So I approached the stable and gently slid the large wooden door open. All three dogs burst out in a frantic rush, as if they had been confined for an extended period, their tails vigorously wagging, tongues lolling out, radiating overwhelming excitement. I quickly surveyed the interior. Nothing appeared out of place. It was just the usual arrangement of hay bales, water buckets, and the various shelves stocked with supplies. I concluded that the wind must have somehow shut the door on them, attributing it to a minor, insignificant event. I then settled myself onto one of the hay bales inside with my snack, allowing the dogs to circle around me persistently, attempting to pilfer bites of my food. It was at that precise moment that I observed someone walking past the openly ajar stable door. It was simply a lanky figure somewhat hunched over, with stringy gray hair cascading past his shoulders. He was muttering incessantly, almost as if he were chanting, yet the sounds were incomprehensible to me. He didn't even cast a glance in our direction, but simply continued walking, seemingly drifting towards the chicken coop. What was truly peculiar was that my dogs barely reacted to his presence. Usually they would bark ferociously at any stranger, even our neighbor, if he happened to be wearing an unfamiliar hat. But this time they merely wagged their tails passively and resumed their intense focus on my food, as if this individual were a completely normal, familiar presence. Prompted by this odd behavior, I rose and stealthily crept towards the stable door to gain a clearer vantage point. I watched him lean over the coop, appearing to be searching for something. Then I witnessed him extract an egg, hold it up to his face, utter something to it as if he were speaking to an infant or offering a prayer, and then, without hesitation, bite into it entirely, shell and all. I could distinctly hear the audible crunch from where I stood. The yolk dripped messily down his beard, and he appeared to be chewing on gravel. It was a profoundly disturbing sight, one that I, at 10 years old, was utterly incapable of processing. The initial shock seemed to dissipate abruptly because I then let out a loud scream. He turned to face me, his face thoroughly coated in egg, with pieces of shell embedded in his beard. Yet he did not cease chewing. He simply stood there, his eyes locked onto mine, continuing to eat as if I were the one disrupting his meal. I bolted, running at full speed, skillfully evading the dogs, scrambling up the porch steps, and rushing into the kitchen, where I slammed the door with such force that I felt the entire frame vibrate. I immediately locked it, then stood there, gasping for breath, still able to hear his strange, continuous muttering from outside. I cautiously peeked out the window, hoping he had departed, but no. There he stood, in the very center of our yard, his eyes fixed intently on the back door, while our dogs contentedly licked his fingers as if they were old acquaintances. I dashed for the telephone and urgently called my mother at her workplace. I was trembling so violently that I could barely articulate a single word, but I somehow managed to convey that someone was in the yard and I was unsure what to do. She instructed me to go upstairs, lock myself securely in my room, and remain hidden until she or law enforcement arrived. I did not argue. I could hear his furious pounding on the back door even before I reached the stairs. Upstairs, I locked my bedroom door and squeezed myself tightly under the bed, remaining perfectly still. I could hear him circling the perimeter of the house, repeatedly banging on windows, still muttering and occasionally shouting unintelligible phrases. It felt akin to listening to someone attempting to summon a supernatural entity. I genuinely believed he was on the verge of shattering a window and entering. Time often behaves strangely when one is consumed by such fear. It felt like an eternity, though it likely amounted to no more than 10 or 15 minutes, before I heard the unmistakable scream of police sirens and then shouts from outside. I cautiously peered out from beneath the bed and slowly crept back down to the living room. My mother had just burst through the front door, and upon seeing me, she practically tackled me into a fierce embrace. I was far too shaken to feel any embarrassment. The police had successfully calmed the man down and were in the process of taking him into custody. He hadn't actually committed any violent acts, so they weren't treating him as a criminal, but they assured us they would be in contact once they had more information. A week later, they returned and provided us with the complete narrative. It turned out that the man had been secretly living in our stable, sneaking in during the night and concealing himself throughout the day. He was homeless, suffering from mental illness, and had apparently discontinued his medication. He harbored no intentions of harming anyone. He was merely endeavoring to survive the cold nights. The dogs had, over time, likely grown accustomed to his presence and no longer perceived him as a threat. My mother, true to her compassionate nature, chose not to press charges. Instead, she actively assisted him in connecting with social services and even ensured he secured a place to reside. She visited him on a regular basis, supported him in resuming his medication, and even offered him minor tasks to perform on our property. Ultimately, he attained stable housing, secured part-time employment at her animal wellness clinic, and received extensive support from numerous individuals within the town. He subsequently lived a remarkably fulfilling life. We maintained contact for several decades, and he genuinely became a cherished friend to our family. He passed away earlier this year, and our entire family attended his funeral. It's quite ironic how someone who initially instilled more fear in me than anyone else throughout my childhood ultimately became an integral part of our lives for such a prolonged period. Life, indeed, presents such peculiar turns. Story 2. The Unseen Occupant. This particular incident unfolded back in early 2017 at a juncture when I was actively striving for a fresh start. I had recently departed a sprawling metropolis on the West Coast, where I had spent an excessively long duration entangled with undesirable company and even more detrimental habits. I eventually found myself settling into a minuscule, easily overlooked town somewhere within the vast expanse of Colorado, earnestly hoping that a more leisurely pace of life would facilitate my journey towards self-discovery. However, prior to my relocation, I had undertaken a brief horticultural trimming assignment in Northern California for a specific couple. The male partner was something of a control enthusiast, constantly expounding passionately about his plants as if they possessed a sacred significance. His female counterpart was an eccentrically spiritual individual, frequently engaging in the burning of sage and discoursing extensively on the mystical implications of moon phases. I harbored no great affection for either of them, but they compensated me fairly enough for the season's labor, and we subsequently went our separate ways, or so I initially presumed. Several months later, quite unexpectedly, the woman sent me a message inquiring if I would be amenable to house-sitting for a couple of weeks, while they embarked on an overseas journey to Morocco, I believe. They even extended an offer of supplementary compensation to assist in trimming some of the residual plant material they still possessed. At that specific point in time, I was financially strained, navigating a period between employment opportunities and feeling a certain degree of desperation. Consequently, I accepted their proposition. I meticulously packed my belongings, undertook the arduous 16 or 17-hour drive all the way back to California, reassuring myself that it would be a straightforward means of earning quick money. That initial burst of optimism regrettably proved to be short-lived. The house was situated in an exceptionally secluded location, the kind of place one would only ever chance upon if utterly disoriented or engaged in clandestine activities. On their property, they maintained a distinct, smaller residential unit, which they referred to as the gardener's quarters, and this was designated as my accommodation. It featured its own compact kitchen, a private bathroom, and a connecting door that ostensibly led into the main house. Except they meticulously screwed that door shut while I was physically observing them. They literally employed a power drill to secure it right there as I stood by. In retrospect, that particular action should have served as my unequivocal first warning to turn around and immediately return home. Initially, everything appeared to proceed quite normally. I diligently fed the dogs, watered the various plants, trimmed a small portion of their leftover stash, and generally reveled in the prevailing peace and quiet. However, after a few days, I began to perceive unsettling sounds. These included the distinct sound of a faucet running, the sharp clang of a microwave door closing, and the murmur of voices emanating from within the main house, the very section of the dwelling from which I was supposedly barred. I promptly messaged the couple, anticipating a casual reply such as, "Oh yes, the timer must have activated," or "We neglected to inform you that the cleaner makes regular visits." Instead, their verbatim response was, "Don't worry about anything happening on the other side of the wall." That chilling response sent an unmistakable shiver directly down my spine. Over the subsequent days, I observed further strange phenomena: whispers, discernible movements, a faint television glow visible from beneath the connecting door, and the dogs reacting as if a familiar individual were circulating inside the main residence. It wasn't the sensation of a break-in, No, this felt distinctly more like someone had simply never departed. One evening, while I was outdoors enjoying a smoke, I distinctly heard footsteps circling the building. I devised a rather simplistic yet effective ruse. I pretended to re-enter the quarters, dramatically slammed the door shut, but instead remained cleverly concealed within the encompassing shadows. Not even 5 seconds later, I observed someone stealthily emerging from around the corner of the house, pausing briefly when they failed to see me inside, and then sprinting rapidly back into the adjacent woods. That observation unequivocally confirmed my suspicions. I was not succumbing to delusion. Someone was indeed residing within that house while I was performing my house-sitting duties. And whether the couple was complicit in this arrangement remained unclear, but their subsequent text messages began to take on a decidedly bizarre tone. The woman would make specific references to actions I had performed that day in a manner that strongly suggested she had been personally observing me. I meticulously scoured every inch of that room, diligently searching for cameras, but ultimately failed to locate a single one. Nevertheless, I could not dislodge the persistent sensation that I was under constant surveillance throughout my entire stay. Following this realization, I chose to fully embrace the absurdity of the situation. I began to deliberately blast high-energy bubblegum pop music, perform rather foolish dance routines in front of the windows, and purposefully rearrange objects into unconventional and bizarre patterns. My reasoning was that if someone was indeed watching me, I might as well provide them with a spectacle they would never forget, or at the very least, make them seriously reconsider any malicious intentions towards me. It was a strange form of reverse psychology, bordering on horror logic, but honestly, it proved instrumental in preventing me from completely losing my composure. Eventually, the couple returned from their vacation, acting as if absolutely nothing out of the ordinary had transpired. They even exhibited hesitation in paying me, an act I found utterly humorous given the entirety of the unsettling experience I had endured. I did ultimately receive my compensation, but the whole ordeal remained deeply etched in my memory. Never again, I vowed. Story 3. The Persistent Watcher. The agricultural estate where my father and I currently reside is situated quite literally in the middle of nowhere. We are approximately a half-hour drive from the nearest urban center, and there exists a dilapidated settlement about a mile away, which is essentially comprised of boarded-up structures and pervasive gang graffiti. On certain nights, the faint sounds of gunshots can be heard, sometimes originating from far across the expansive fields, near the train tracks. Candidly, we have experienced our share of unsettling incidents out here, but one particular night from several months ago has remained with me more vividly than any other. There was an inexplicable quality to it that felt disturbingly personal. This entire sequence of events commenced on a specific night in early autumn, when my father and I were relaxing in our backyard. We had a small fire burning, the night sky was brightly illuminated by a resplendent full moon, and it was one of those rare evenings where a profound sense of calmness pervaded everything. Coyotes could be heard howling distantly, the air was refreshingly cool, and the entire property seemed to glow under the ethereal moonlight. It was just my father and me, sitting there in tranquil silence, and for a brief moment, everything felt genuinely peaceful. Then an aged, battered Chevy truck slowly advanced along the road past our driveway and gradually reduced its speed. My initial assumption was that the driver had missed a turn and needed to maneuver the vehicle to reverse direction, but he continued to creep past the entrance with extreme slowness. Subsequently, he accelerated again and vanished down the road. I dismissed it as an inconsequential occurrence. However, he soon returned, and then again the identical truck, performing this peculiar loop that clearly involved traversing a dirt road to circle back towards our property. By the fourth instance of this behavior, my father had reached his limit and contacted the county law enforcement office. They dispatched an officer to patrol the vicinity, and predictably, the truck disappeared for a period. We concluded that this marked the end of the incident. A strange evening, to be sure, but nothing of serious consequence. Yet, a week later, I discovered that our initial assessment was gravely mistaken. The topographical configuration of our land makes it quite easy to overlook details if one is not paying meticulous attention. Our house is almost entirely enveloped by tall, dense bushes, and a small patch of forest lies directly behind us, with a meandering creek nearby and wetlands extending beyond that. The sole accessible opening is our driveway, and even that is somewhat recessed from the main road. Thus, one can readily comprehend how an individual could move surreptitiously around the property without being easily detected. That particular evening, I was home alone, walking past the bushes and near the rear boundary of the pasture. It was then that I observed a blue F-150 truck gently slowing down the road. To my surprise, it turned directly into our driveway. The driver did not merely pull in and immediately back out as if disoriented. Instead, he halted the vehicle and remained seated there. I cannot precisely articulate what it was, but something within me instantly froze. I instinctively ducked behind a birch tree and maintained my gaze upon him through the screen of leaves. Fortunately, I was still wearing my camouflage jacket and hat from earlier, which allowed me to blend somewhat effectively with the surrounding foliage. After approximately a minute, he emerged from the truck. He appeared to be an older gentleman, likely approaching 60 years of age, dressed in a gray hoodie and jeans. He possessed long hair, parted down the middle, which seemed to float casually behind him. He surveyed his surroundings as if actively searching for something. More specifically, it seemed as though he was looking for someone. I crouched lower behind the tree and continuously shifted my position, ensuring I remained on the opposite side of the trunk whenever he moved. Throughout this entire ordeal, I had my knife with me, but even with that reassurance, my primary focus was solely on devising a silent escape plan into the brush should I need to flee. He meandered around the yard for a few minutes, constantly turning his head every few seconds as if anticipating someone to suddenly appear, but he did not thoroughly inspect the entire property. Eventually, he conceded, returned to his truck, and drove off as if the entire incident had never occurred. Afterward, I immediately contacted my father. Upon his return, we went to speak with our neighbor, a benevolent individual who resides slightly to our east and consistently remains vigilant. He theorized that it might have been an individual in the area known for trespassing on people's properties and engaging in theft. Perhaps he was correct, but something about that explanation did not sit well with me. I genuinely do not believe he was merely searching for material possessions. I am convinced that he was actively seeking me. I still frequently reflect upon that unsettling evening, particularly whenever I am alone in the backyard. I have developed the habit of checking behind me more frequently than I used to. In this rural environment, one anticipates the presence of coyotes lurking in the darkness. However, it is the sight of people watching from the road that truly rattles one's composure. Story 4. When I was 17 years old, I had a part-time employment opportunity delivering pizzas for an established old-fashioned eatery that was situated precisely at the perimeter of our town. It was somewhat discreetly nestled between the final strip mall and the extensive farmlands that stretched out beyond the bypass. Our town itself presented a rather polished suburban aesthetic. However, just beyond its immediate confines lay these lesser-known backroads, which were characterized by a landscape of ancient trailers, weathered barns, and dusty, antiquated fuel stations. These were the types of locales where individuals dressed in oil-stained overalls would typically congregate after enduring long, arduous shifts. The Village Hearth Pies establishment where I was employed was a no-frills kind of place that had been in operation for an extended period, catering predominantly to that specific demographic of people. On nights with fewer customers, I would often be the sole delivery driver, and on one particular night, this circumstance certainly did not work to my advantage. It was just past 9 p.m. when a delivery order was received. It requested 2 pizzas and a 2-liter bottle of soda, destined for a property approximately 10 minutes outside of the main town area. My GPS guided me off the primary thoroughfare and onto a gravel driveway that seemed interminably long, winding its way between towering wheat fields that almost completely enveloped my small sedan. The destination featured a reasonably well-maintained house, 2 barns, and what appeared to be several assorted metal structures dispersed across the expansive property. I am generally not comfortable with such isolated locations. They consistently agitate my nerves, especially when I find myself there alone, which was unequivocally the case on this occasion. After waiting in my car for several minutes without anyone emerging from the house, I concluded that it would be prudent to call the telephone number provided on the order. The man answered after a noticeable delay, and his voice was distinctly rough and gravelly, the kind of tone that immediately brought to mind someone whose sustenance relied entirely on strong black coffee and endless cigarettes. He instructed me to meet him at his truck, which was purportedly located near one of the barns in the distant back corner of the property. So I found myself cautiously advancing deeper into this unfamiliar territory, with tall grass audibly brushing against my car windows and not a single soul in sight, save for the faint silhouette of a truck positioned near one of those colossal silver grain silos. When I finally pulled up to the designated spot, I deliberately remained inside my vehicle and called him again, optimistically hoping we could swiftly conclude the transaction without any awkwardness or bizarre occurrences. Instead, with that same gruff inflection, he directed me to place the pizzas and the soda onto his truck bed. He had already completed the payment online, so I had anticipated a quick, straightforward exchange. However, I still possessed a receipt that required his signature. Therefore, I walked around to the passenger side of his truck, expecting he would simply scrawl something illegible and permit me to depart. It was at that precise moment that I obtained a clear view of him. He was likely in his mid-40s, heavy set, wearing a faded trucker hat and sporting a thick, unkempt beard. He simply stared at me intently when I requested a pen. Rather than providing an answer, he nodded meaningfully towards the back of his truck and uttered, with a chilling undertone, "If you ask for a tip, I'll be shoving this tip down your damn throat." My gaze instinctively shifted into the truck bed, and there it was, an old double-barrel shotgun, casually lying there as if it were merely another tool in his collection. My entire body immediately tensed up, as if my brain was attempting to render me immobile with shock. But my sole coherent thought was to escape that situation without exacerbating its danger. I slowly retreated, murmured something akin to, "Okay, have a good night," and practically dived headfirst into my car. My car's tires were not designed for traversing gravel surfaces, but I pushed that vehicle so relentlessly that I genuinely believed the bumper might detach. I flew down that lengthy driveway, then on to the main road, maintaining a speed of at least 80 miles per hour, all the way back to the pizza shop. When I recounted the incident to the other employees, they all laughed dismissively, as if I were attempting to concoct a story more dramatic than a horror film plot. No one believed a single word of my account. I eventually moved past the experience, but approximately a year later, that same individual placed an order again, this time during the lunch shift. On this occasion, I flat out refused to take the delivery. However, we were operating with minimal staff and resources, and the manager essentially stated, that we simply could not afford to reject any customer. So, against my better judgment, I went. It was broad daylight on a Sunday, which offered a slight measure of comfort, and this time he was patiently waiting at the front door of his house, rather than near some isolated, unsettling barn. When I pulled up, he emerged before I even fully parked the car. He actually extended an apology, explaining that he had been enduring a nasty divorce at the time and had unfortunately vented his anger onto the wrong person. He handed me $60, reiterated his apology, and I departed without uttering much in return, simply grateful that whatever the nature of that terrifying night had been, it was not destined to repeat itself. Story 5. The Deceptive Homestead. A few years ago, during my formative youth, and while I was still navigating the complexities of early adulthood, I entered into marriage directly after completing high school. My husband and I were both experiencing a period of aimlessness, genuinely uncertain about our next steps in life. We decided to forego further collegiate education, packed up the entirety of our modest apartment, and conceived the idea of exploring something fundamentally different before the full weight of adult responsibilities descended upon us. This is how we ultimately found ourselves volunteering on a secluded rural property that was advertised as a unique learn-by-doing homestead experience. The individual managing this operation asserted that he would impart skills in carpentry, welding, and construction, essentially offering a comprehensive, hands-on immersive course in various trades. In return for this education, we would simply assist with tasks around the property while residing there, free of charge. The accompanying photographs depicted a scene reminiscent of a nature magazine spread, a grand wooden house that he claimed to have constructed entirely himself, boasting ample space and an inviting, cozy ambiance. He stated that he frequently hosted couples such as ourselves, possessed extensive experience, and assured us that we would be an integral part of a larger cohort, collectively learning and laboring. All of his promotional materials consistently employed plural pronouns like we, fostering the impression that an entire team managed the establishment, and the overall presentation appeared polished and exceptionally well organized. After a series of exchanges via messages, we felt entirely confident about the opportunity and proceeded to book our flights. However, upon our arrival, there were no other volunteers or workers present. It was solely him. He was a man in his 60s, still remarkably physically capable and intellectually astute. He greeted us with a rehearsed charm that, while outwardly polite, conveyed an underlying sense of artificiality. One of the very first remarks he made was something to the effect of, "I don't care about what someone's done in the past. I believe in change." Initially, we simply attributed this to some quaint, folksy wisdom. He then took us on a grocery shopping excursion and instructed us to select anything we desired, which initially seemed generous, but also possessed an oddly performative quality. It was at this juncture that we began to discern subtle details that simply did not align correctly. He had constructed the entire house himself, and the upstairs bathroom, which was, in fact, the only one available, was solely accessible by passing directly through his personal bedroom. Furthermore, and more disturbingly, the bathroom door completely lacked a lock. Whenever he extended an invitation for us to enter his room to converse or to display various items, there would invariably be an old camcorder resting on his table, accompanied by dozens of mini-tapes scattered liberally around it. He frequently brought up his profound affection for Japanese culture, emphasizing how he specifically endeavored to host guests from Japan, and noting that several young women from that country had stayed previously but had abruptly departed. He subtly dropped hints about former guests who had either become intimidated or were simply unable to manage the rigorous work. It did not take us long to conclude that no one truly stayed for an extended duration. One day, quite unexpectedly, he announced that we would be traveling into the nearest city to attend to some errands. Following the lengthy drive, he suddenly proposed that we assist him in recruiting new help by approaching young adults downtown and extending an invitation for them to return to the ranch with him. That entire proposition sent an unpleasant sensation crawling over our skin. It felt profoundly exploitative, and he became visibly annoyed when we expressed hesitation. We ultimately pretended to acquiesce to his request while he wandered off, attempting to persuade strangers to accompany him back to his property. As the days progressed, his demeanor began to noticeably shift. He became easily agitated, frequently made passive-aggressive remarks, and appeared to possess absolutely no sense of personal boundaries. His opinions regarding women were, at best, demonstrably outdated, and he would often speak over me or utter peculiar comments that felt deliberately intended to provoke a reaction. Physically, he was a formidable individual, an ex-military man, constantly pacing with an almost calculating energy, as if meticulously planning something within his own mind. In retrospect, I am convinced he was always meticulously monitoring us. Our respective families had harbored skepticism about the entire arrangement from its very inception, particularly our parents. We had dismissed their concerns at the time, believing we had conducted sufficient background checks. What we had failed to do, however, was to actually search for his full name. That oversight changed dramatically one morning when I received a panicked email from my mother. She had conducted a swift online search and unearthed multiple forums and articles explicitly warning people against visiting that location, alongside an old arrest record specifically tied to sexual assault charges from years prior. We were utterly aghast, our faces draining of color. We instantly realized that we had been sleeping under the same roof as an individual with a profoundly dark past. Our immediate concern shifted to devising a strategy for departure without inadvertently provoking him. What amplified the urgency of our predicament was his continuous hinting about us remaining permanently, even discussing future holiday celebrations together and the prospect of raising children on his land. We had never once even alluded to the possibility of a long-term stay, yet he was already meticulously mapping out an entire life for us, as if it were an undeniable certainty. I fabricated a story about a sudden family emergency back home, and the very instant I began speaking, I swear he already comprehended the deception. His facial expression remained largely impassive, but something subtly shifted in his eyes, as if he were meticulously analyzing every word I uttered in real time. Before I even finished explaining, he stated, "All right, when do we leave for the airport?" His voice was devoid of any emotion, cold and utterly flat. On the drive to the airport, he reverted to his previously cheerful, generous persona, as if none of the unsettling events of the preceding days had ever transpired. He assured us that we were always welcome to return, even offering to cover the cost of our return tickets, should we reconsider. We departed that day and never initiated contact with him again. Months later, I conducted another search using his name and discovered an entire online message board explicitly dedicated to warning other potential victims. Dozens of posts from individuals who had stayed there, most of whom were couples, detailed experiences eerily congruent with our own. They recounted the unusual bathroom arrangement, the ever-present camcorder, the references to Japanese women, the reports of ritual circles observed in the woods under full moons, and even the specific incident where he attempted to recruit strangers in the city. It was all precisely the same. The local law enforcement authorities were unable to take action because no one possessed sufficient hard evidence. However, The accounts continue to accumulate, and from what I can ascertain, he remains active, perpetrating the exact same scheme.